So good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Sigita, for the invitation. I'm always happy to be able to talk to people also across the region, to share the perspectives.
CEE entertainment news. That's how low you've sunk. It's been several
I'm
days
sorry,
since
Paul,
the
Fisled,
pop singer
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I was wondering if it was not here or something. So I think I'll talk about for an hour. I'll try to not keep it short, but try to keep it within the time limit, and then we will leave the time for questions about anything you might be interested in. But first, short self-promotion. As Sigita mentioned, I'm working mostly on the China Observers project, which is focused on China's presence in the whole Central and Eastern Europe region. So if you're interested in this topic, this is basically the best place to go to read all the analysis, whether it's research papers, podcasts, regular articles, basically anything about what's happening in the region with China. And the other project, if you're also interested, Map Influence, is more focused on the Visegrad countries and also on the issue of Chinese propaganda, disinformation. So if you're interested in that, please check that out. And also we're planning a summer school project this May in Czech Republic, in the beautiful town of Kutná Hora. So we're looking for students from all over Europe. So if you're interested, you can also check the chinaobservers.eu website, and there you have all the information. We'll be really happy to have also students from Latvia, of course, apply. So just feel free to check that out. Anyway, so first of all, I don't really want to spend much time discussing, history, but I think it's still, of course, important to give some background to this. So the CEE nations, actually after the Second World War in 1949, when the People's Republic was founded, were among the first ones to recognize the PRC. Of course, the Soviet Union, which at the time included many of the Eastern European countries, was one of the most important allies, or the most important ally of the Chinese People's Republic. So this was, you could say, this was a honeymoon period of the relationship. But this really changed with the Sino-Soviet split from the 1960s, when these countries, as basically satellites of the Soviet Union, they had to follow also the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. So they would denounce China, and basically they would stop any kind of relationship with China for a few decades. So the relations were basically frozen until the 1980s. There was very little contact, so there was not much communication going on between the countries. So the reason I put this tractor here is that this is the symbol still of like the first honeymoon period of cooperation, specifically related to Czech Republic, which Czechoslovakia at the time donated some few hundreds of farming equipment in China, and this is still remembered in China as a symbol of cooperation. So you still have, like, even now, China going back to these times and showing, look at how good our relationship was, how all these countries recognized us and gave us support. So they're basically not really like skipping over all these decades when the relationship were really bad. So which is kind of interesting. And China often talks about the traditional friendship between CEE countries and China, which is kind of true. At the same time, these are really, countries which had the regimes installed by Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. So it's kind of problematic framing. So what happened, of course, in the late 1980s is that you had the series of democratic revolutions in centuries and Eastern Europe. You, of course, had the USSR disintegrating, the Baltic republics, Ukraine, Belarus, going through a road of independence. And at the time, there were some signs that the relations were getting better actually with China, but suddenly it all changed, of course. I think it's a really good contrast that actually on the very same day, you had the first democratic election in Poland on the June 4th, 1989. The very same day you had the massacre in Beijing, the Tiananmen Square. So this really shows the contrasting roads that the China and many countries in Central and Eastern Europe were taking. And actually, what was happening in the region was seen by China as a warning story. So, you know, they were saying we should study what happened there and we should really avoid that, because we don't want, you know, the, of course, democratic revolutions. We want to preserve the communist regime. So until now, this is very much studied by Chinese, you know, in internal, you know, communist study groups of the Communist Party. They still very much study this. They study, of course, the USSR and, you know, how to avoid the fate of Gorbachev. So this very much figures in Chinese Communist Party's, you know, understanding of the challenges that it faces. And then in the 1990s, we of course had the road back to Europe for many countries in CEE, to NATO, and this led to basically a lot of estrangement with China. You know, these countries were not really interested in cooperation with China. I'm sorry, is there something, Sigita?
Yes, I'm sorry, slides are not moving. I believe you wanted to move slides, right?
Yeah, I was just still staying here. I'm not.
Okay, it's fine then. Sorry.
Saying for now.
It's fine then. Sorry, because I saw
Okay.
historical context. That's why I asked it. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So, you know, these countries were not really interested in cooperating with China. They were mostly interested in the transatlantic cooperation. And of course, you also had a lot of controversial human rights issues. You know, these countries, based on their history, they put a lot of focus on human rights, but also the issues of Taiwan, Tibet. For example, in Czech Republic, this has been a very big issue, but also in the Baltic countries. For example, you had Macedonia recognize Taiwan even in 1999, which is kind of a forgotten story, but that's very interesting background. So what happened again in 2000s or late 2000s? You had the economic crisis of 2008, which proved as kind of a wake-up call for many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which were kind of worried about the continued dependence on the European markets. For many countries, it's really dependence on Germany and the industrial chains, supply chains that are centered around Germany. And they're looking to diversify their ties. And this is really something that was happening all around the region. So it was more of a structural thing. Basically, in every single country, I don't know like specifically the situation on Latvia, but I would bet that this is also something that was very much discussed. So, you know, looking east, finding new partners, and of course, China was presented as the most interesting partner in that. And at the same time, China was becoming more involved on the global stage. There was this going out strategy where Chinese companies were supported to be more involved on the global market, you know, finding new partners. So basically the meat or the interests of the both sides met at the same time. And also in the context of the development of EU-China ties, the CEE countries, many of them most of them were newly integrated into the European Union. So they were seen as some kind of new potential friends for China, because the relationship with most Western European countries was already quite developed. So CEE could be seen as a new engine for the China-EU ties. And finally, there was also this discourse, very much in Czech Republic, which I know most intimately, that in terms of developing a relationship with China, we should be really catching up with the West, because look at Germany. Look at how Merkel is fighting for German companies and their interests in China. So this was also very much just catching up with what was happening already. So what we had happen in this context, or this context of finding way to each other again, was the establishment of the 16+1 format. We see a photo from one of the summits, and which will be like the main focus of what I'm talking about today. So there was the first summit in Warsaw in 2012. And it has been going on ever since, with the most attention paid to the annual summits, which have been happening ever since. What 16+1, which involved all these countries, because it's been known as 17+1 for a time, but I'll just go back to this map in a bit. It's very representative of very typical Chinese model of multilateralism. So you have the very similar arrangement in Africa or in Latin America. As in Africa, you have FOCAC, for example. So China recalls this multilateralism, but it is not really multilateralism, and it doesn't really work that way. So it works as basically as a hub and spokes system for China. As just imagine a wheel where China is in the middle, and it has some kind of connection to all the countries, but the countries are not really that much connected to each other. So it's really based on the principle of bilateral multilateralism. So it's all these countries together coming to deal with China, but not really communicating among themselves. And it's really China driving the whole agenda of the cooperation. So this is really shown also by the fact that the coordinating institution is actually set up at the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And this is the only, could say, permanent institution of the kind for the format. So also shows that the China is really driving the agenda. So this is not an international institution that's doesn't have its mechanism and so on. So it's very China-driven format. Another thing is the huge diversity of participants. So in 2012, it were these countries that were involved by China in it. It was China who decided who would be involved. So that also shows who was in the driving seat. Greece was not there at the time because China was presenting the whole thing as basically developing relations with former post-Soviet countries or countries in the Soviet sphere, post-communist countries, which Greece was not. So it were these 16 countries without Greece, and of course this is a hugely diverse group of countries. So we had countries that were in EU, that, for example, Croatia was not in EU at the time, if I'm not mistaken. Countries that are integrated in NATO, countries that have very different, level of social development. So we have, for example, countries like, I don't know, Slovenia or Czech Republic. Then you have for example, Bosnia, which there is just a huge difference between these countries, and of course also in the geopolitical direction of this country. So some of them, for example, have good relations with Russia, let's say Serbia, and then, for example, the Baltic countries or Poland, of course, are very wary of Russia. So even if it seems as kind of a homogeneous group, it's really is not so. And of course, when you look at this map, now it's been 16 plus 1 in the beginning because you had 16 members. Then you had Greece joined the format in 2019, and then last year you had Lithuania leave. So it's again 16 plus 1. So it's like a difficult math really to follow. So, but this diversity really is something that is not necessary for China. It can be a problem, you know, because you have to attend to the needs of different countries at the different economic level and so on. At the same time, you have a lot of internal competition of these countries that are kind of striving for China's attention. And this is also kind of built into how this 16 plus 1 forum, but also other formats by China work. So that, you know, you give for example, you have summit, you give every single leader 15 minutes to meet with the Chinese prime minister, and you know they're just trying to use the time as best as possible to attract attention to them, to come up with some projects, and China is of course profiting for that from that. It also means that China can save a lot of diplomatic resources. You know, they don't have to meet every single leader of every single country. They just have this summit every year where they can meet everyone and basically save diplomatic resources. There's also the issue of 16 plus 1 and Belt and Road Initiative, which I think will be familiar with. So many people kind of see it as part of the same thing, which is kind of true. But actually, the 16 plus 1 predates the Belt and Road Initiative. You know, the huge infrastructure initiative by China. So 16 plus 1 was announced in 2012. Belt and Road was formed in 2013, 14. But actually, 16 plus 1 was later kind of integrated into it. What's kind of similar between these two things as like from China's perspective is the bottom-up approach, you know, the typical Chinese approach in foreign policy, where you're crossing the river by filling the stones, which means that even we often think that China has a long-term strategy in place and is devising like everything with a horizon of even decades. It's not really the fact, or the practice of Chinese policy tells us otherwise. So crossing the river by filling the stones means basically adapting the formats to what the responses of the countries, how the conditions change, and so on. So this is also very much in 16 plus 1, with China trying to find out what it can actually offer these countries, how it should approach them, and so on. Another quite typical thing, which is similar for Belt and Road and 16 plus 1, is the proliferation of many different formats. So I mentioned the annual summits, which are you could say the most important thing of the format, but it's by far not the only kind of cooperation mechanism going on. So actually, you have different kinds of, they're not like formal multilateral institutions, but you have different kind of sectoral cooperation mechanisms, you know, like for tourism, for education, logistics, which was established actually in Latvia, local leaders cooperation, so cooperation on subnational level, and so on. So it's a huge proliferation of different formats and also kind of like quasi institutions, that's my favorite thing, which I always show, is the China CEE dance camp. So it's it's really led to some people saying, this is becoming kind of an empty show. There's a lot of stuff happening, but it doesn't really matter that much. Like the cooperation was supposed to be about mostly economics, as I mentioned. These CEE countries looking into expanding economic ties with China, but now you have all kinds of different formats where you have like people-to-people ties and so on happening. But I would argue that was actually a big part of what China wanted. So on the one hand, you have CEE countries looking for economic cooperation, but China kind of wanting to establish its foothold in the region. Also, for example, improve its image by expanding people-to-people ties. And one similar point between Belt and Road and 16+1 is the motto of the connectivity. So I would say that's like one of the most actually tangible parts of China CEE cooperation. Is there a question? I see a hand.
Yes, I'm sorry. If there are any other slide than the first one of the presentation, we haven't seen any of them because we see only the first one.
Okay, you still see only the very first one.
Yeah, maybe that's because you had it on full screen or something. But yeah, now we see the 11th.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought it was just frozen there for a bit.
No, we didn't see anything. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's why I asked, but thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Because I didn't understand. So maybe I'll just give a quick. Did it stop on the very first one? You mean
Yes.
you just saw the very first one with the
Yes,
with the
that's
title?
why I asked.
Okay. So I'll just probably go through it like this. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we can see. Now we see understanding EU-China relations.
Okay. I guess I'll just send you the presentation afterwards to go through these. Okay. Sorry about that. I didn't really.
No worries. Anyway, it was interesting and fruitful to hear.
Yeah. Okay. So you can see the map of the format and the countries that are participating in it. The different formats that I mentioned that are hosted by different countries, which also supports the internal competition, which is helpful, of course, for China. And the dance camp, I mentioned. So just what I was mentioning, the issue of connectivity, which is something that's highlighted within 16+1 and Belt and Road as well. And this, as I said, I would argue is the most tangible part of cooperation, which the reason is, of course, that Central and Eastern Europe is situated in a strategic, geopolitical position. So especially in terms of the railway transit, which has been very burgeoning sector in the past 10 years. So we had all these direct connections by railway, freight, of course, not passenger ones, from China to Europe and back. And you can see the trend line on the graph. I hope you can see it now. Which shows rapid development, and in 2021, I think it went even much higher. So that's one thing where actually cooperation has been quite tangible, but the question is, of course, whether it would have developed even without the political format of 16+1. I would say it probably would have, because it's following economic logic. So the issue with 16+1 from the very beginning, from the EU perspective, was that it was seen as a Trojan horse, as a way for China to get its influence, its foothold within the European Union, some kind of fifth column, as the CEE countries would support China, for example, in on some crucial issues, whether it's trade issues, voting on dumping, for example, measures, or also on issues of sanctions, positions on territorial issues like South China Sea and so on. And basically, you had this discourse coming mostly from Berlin, also from Paris, but also from Brussels, where you would say that China is trying to divide Europe really by this format to create divisions. What this has led to is that there has been some changes to the format. So China has been very much aware of the situation, that that the format has negative image, and it has really stressed from afterwards that the format is complementary to EU, that it wants to support EU integration, that it's not in conflict with European Union's aims and so on. And actually, I have been always critical of this narrative of the Trojan horse, because it doesn't really add up when you look at the reality. So CEE countries have not really, as a whole, become supporting of China's interests. That's not what really has been happening. So this Trojan horse metaphor doesn't really add up. And also you have of course the example of, for example, Hungary and Serbia, but these countries do not really represent the whole region, as we have seen. Recently, with some countries like Lithuania, Czech Republic, actually standing at the forefront of EU's efforts to push for a more hawkish or stronger policy on China. And actually, you had, the best example of how I would say EU can be divided, or what the power dynamics in EU actually are, is the EU-China Comprehensive Investment Agreement from 2020, which was basically agreed by or pushed forward by especially German Chancellor Merkel, of course, as well together with French President Macron. And we heard a lot of complaints from other countries that they were not really consulted on this issue. So I think that's actually the real issue with EU's China policy has not been that the Central Eastern European countries have been supporting China, but that often it's been hijacked by the Franco-German tandem. And the CEE countries have actually, yes, Sigita?
I'm just applauding for your conclusion,
applause.
because it's so true.
Yeah, I just saw the hand. I didn't know what it was doing. But, yeah. And there's the issue of CEE agency, that the countries, and I have said that I'm going to contradict myself a bit here, that China has been in the driving seat. That's true of the format, but that's because of how it was created and how it works. But actually, the individual countries have tried to kind of put pressure on China within the format, and not really just have it serve as some kind of vehicle for China's interests. So when you, for example, look at the communiques of the summits, or when you look at the language of the cooperation, you will see that it's not really that often the typical Chinese diplomatic language. So, and I know, like, also from the background of people who were involved in negotiations, that often there was a lot of, push by the CEE countries, by the Baltic countries, by Poland, Czech Republic, especially, who were pushing for, like including EU language, for this cooperation to be in accordance with EU rules, and pushing against, on the other hand, China trying to like get them committed to support China's interests. So it's not really been just about China doing what it wants. And the final issue is really the exaggerated image of China's presence in CEE. And I'll also get to it in a bit and show some data, graphics on that. But China has not really become a major actor in great majority of CEE countries, and even where it is, like you could say Hungary and Serbia, it's still quite exaggerated. And when you look at the data, and also from the perspective of China's foreign policy, CEE countries are not really that important. So for China, it's more important to have a good relationship with Germany, with France, the UK, which is not in the EU anymore, of course. But these have been also the countries that have pushed most for China's interest, for continued economic cooperation with China, and so on. So this picture doesn't really reflect reality in my mind. So what has happened with the format and with overall Chinese presence in CEE that basically overall you could say term it as unfulfilled expectations about China's presence in the region. The problem has been there from the beginning. China has often framed the ties as some kind of South cooperation, cooperation that's usually with the developing countries of the global South, which, despite the different level of economic development in CEE, it doesn't really apply to the whole region as such. So the mechanisms, the forms of cooperation that China was pushing do not necessarily work here if they work in Africa, for example. And that's also connected to the issue of the China's economic offer, which was the main selling point for countries in the region. So what China can offer or offered here, and especially from the beginning, was the huge infrastructure projects that we know from, again, Latin America or Southeast Asia, where you have basically China, Chinese banks, policy banks offering huge loans to these countries, and they are basically tied to the condition that the construction is going to be undertaken by a Chinese company, that often they're going to bring in their workers, they're going to bring in their materials, and this is not really that interesting especially for the EU countries. So first of all, they don't really need China's loans because they can get much better funding, whether it's EU structural funds or even like other tools that basically allow much better interest conditions and so on. You cannot really just award the contract to a Chinese company like that. So you have like trending procedures, where anybody should be able to join, to apply, and so it just doesn't. You cannot really promise China that. Of course, like we had the issue within EU, for example, in Hungary, where something like that happened, and there's been a EU Commission investigation in that. But this is not something that can really work as such. And maybe the issue and the very background or the crux of the issue is there's not that much structural compatibility between the economies of China and Central and Eastern Europe. So they're both kind of like in the middle. They're not at the highest level of a supply chain, so they're mostly supplying intermediary products. And what China is very interested in are usually two things in the world. So like at the bottom of like the ladder of value, it's really natural resources, which is not really that much a thing in CEE that you could explore. So this was not really something China could really explore here. At the same time, China is interested in Western Europe, in the developed countries, in brands, established companies and so on. Again, in CEE, it's not that many, they're not really that big, if there are, because they usually get bought by, German companies or so on. And especially in V4 countries, all the big companies basically are multinationals, mostly German companies. So, and there's not really that many big brands, China wants brand recognition. This doesn't really offer opportunity for China. So and the form of economic engagement really has also kind of been something that CEE countries were not that much interested in. So most countries always are interested in greenfield investments. So come there, you build a factory from nothing. Whereas China, what it was doing was often, just buying the existing companies, often like also companies that were, for example, China bought a German company or something that had its factories in, for example, Poland. So it was not really a direct purchase, direct investment, and it didn't really bring often like new money or new capital. It was just buying what was already there, and buying and not bringing new employment opportunities. It's true that infrastructure projects have been happening, but they have been happening in Western Balkans. So that's something where you can really skirt the rules, where you don't have necessarily, you don't have the EU to also apply. And when you have, of course, there's also the national legislation, but often it's more easily circumvented, which we have seen in many countries, for example, in Serbia, Montenegro. And there's been also the issue, and specifically in Montenegro, about the debt trap. So, China, and that's the risk that is really connected also to Chinese financial support, or not really support because it's commercial, but, Montenegro lent a huge amount of money for the construction of a highway that they did not really need. The EU, did not recommend the funding for it. There were like some consulting Western companies that said that it doesn't really make economic sense, but China was very happy to offer their funds. But what happened that Montenegro was not really able to repay that. So it has had this debate about China intentionally putting these countries into a debt trap. But I think it's kind of exaggerated. It doesn't really show that China is going to misuse this vulnerability. It's more about China not really being that experience with this, because in the end, China doesn't want to, it doesn't want to have the negative press from, I don't know, taking Montenegro territory, which it theoretically, I think, could, some kind of land or, some kind of collateral. It doesn't really want that. So it's mostly about China, often rushing into things, Chinese banks not really doing, any kind of feasibility studies and so on. Some data also on Chinese economic presence. It's just like a very overall picture about that. So you can see that, especially in terms of like the net level of Chinese investment, Central and Eastern Europe doesn't really figure in top spots. The situation changes a bit with like when you look at the percentage of the whole FDI stock, but it's still, we can see that Chinese investment has mostly been directed at Germany, UK, Italy. So these countries that I mentioned, there's you have like advanced technology, know-how, brands, and so on. And you can also see the comparison with the investment from Germany, as I said, very important for many countries in the region, and and the US, which especially for the Visegrad countries, V4 countries, is really incomparable. So we have a huge amount of German investment. China doesn't really register much. What all this has led to these unfulfilled expectations, and this was one of the factors I'm going to talk about more. And what this led to was the degradation of the 16+ format. You could say it was losing its breath already before even Greece joined in 2019. It was actually seen as a way to show that there's something happening in the format, and Greece has a lot of cooperation with China. So they basically artificially hyped the existing cooperation by adding a country that was not there initially. So what has really happened is that from 17+1, it has changed into 2+1, you could say, where we have like Hungary, Serbia as like the most enthusiastic countries that are still interested in cooperation with China and support China on all kinds of strategic issues, but as such, it doesn't really apply to the whole region. And of course, last year, 2021, you had a very high-profile exit of Lithuania from the format, which kind of was the biggest hit to this cooperation format so far. But like the overall factors that have led to this, I have mentioned the disappointment with economic results, of course, the COVID-19, of course, and the resulting, changes of perception of China, because of course the association with the pandemic itself, with letting it happen or spread, you could say. Then of course the issues of aggressive Chinese diplomacy and propaganda that was also connected with COVID-19. The issues of ideology have very much resurfaced. So as I said, they were very present in the 1990s, but they came back with full force, of course, with also the changing situation in China, becoming much worse in terms of human rights record, the Uyghur issue. So this has also led to the change of public opinion, of course, to China. So we have seen basically across the board worsening relations or worsening perception of China among the public. The new issue that popped up was the security concerns. So if you asked like 10 years ago if there were some security concerns related to China, not many people would list many, because China was not seen as a direct security threat as opposed to Russia, of course, for example. But you had the issue of Chinese technological companies, Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, also not just 5G companies, but companies involved in surveillance, camera systems and so on. So this is quite a new issue that was reflected, and also this, the spying concerns, the concerns about Chinese United Front activities, and all these issues came, to the surface. Aggressive Chinese policy was kind of what I mentioned with COVID-19. So China becoming very assertive or even aggressive in supporting its aims. You probably all heard about the wolf warrior diplomacy. So China being very vocal about many issues, like hitting back and even criticizing some countries, like for their human rights records, which is kind of new. Big factor, of course, is US pressure. China says actually that the whole change of perception of China in the region is due to the US pressure. It's not really the fact, but it's a factor, of course. So with the Trump administration, you had the United States focusing much more on China as such, as a global challenge. So countries, of course, that are supportive of the US in the region have also kind of tried to follow the US policy, and especially on 5G issue, the US has been most influential. But it's not just been about the US. You had the change in EU policy as well. You know, the famous dictum of China as a systemic competitor from 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So this has been an overall trend, really, where European countries have changed their view of China, not just as an economic opportunity, but in many ways as a competitor and as a threat, also in terms of values, for example. You had the Free Seas initiative appear, of course, as some kind of competitor to 16+1 as such, in terms of especially infrastructure, which also lessened the appeal of 16+1, and finally the issue of ties with Taiwan. And suddenly Taiwan again, it was very much a thing in the 1990s, but Taiwan was interested in expanding its ties in the region. But again, Taiwan used this opportunity when China's image was rapidly worsening to also expand ties with many countries in the region, especially, of course, Lithuania, Czech Republic, but Slovakia also, Poland, other countries. We have here something on the Czech Republic, but maybe just very briefly, because it's quite interesting, also experience or case study of Chinese presence in the whole region, and basically has reflected the overall trends. Czech Republic has traditionally been very critical of China. You know, in the 1990s, 2000s, there's been this tradition of human rights foreign policy of former President Havel, who was the leader of the anti-communist revolution. So this also led to a lot of focus in China, specifically also on issues of Tibet, Taiwan in Czech foreign policy. And you know, on the background of this, after the economic crisis in early 2010s, you also had in Czech Republic like the increasing belief that the ties with China should be improved, so that, you know, the economic cooperation, so that the Chinese investment comes and so on. So we should really put these controversial issues of human rights and all these other issues on the side and focus on pragmatic cooperation. And there was a huge hype about the cooperation. So you had, of course, it reached its summit, you could say, in 2016, when Chinese President Xi Jinping visited as its first Chinese leader, Chinese president, the Czech Republic. You know, he got royal treatment, really. So there are numbers flying around about how many billions of Chinese investments were supposed to come, and it was very connected also to like one Chinese company, CEFC. I don't know if you heard about the case, which really built a lot of close contacts with the Czech like highest echelons of power, with President Zeman, of course, but with also people in the government, with, you know, former politicians, lobbyists, and so on. So when you see this, the head of CFC company, Ye Jianming, was actually appointed an advisor for President Zeman, and this was actually a very shady, you could say, guy. Nobody knew really that much about him, so it was very you know, suspicious. You could say a lot of concerns going on what was happening, and of course this like the symbol of cooperation with the panda and the little mole, the most famous Czech cartoon character, which kind of characterized the improved ties. But what really happened with CFC was that suddenly, like after it actually made a lot of investments, but they just went on a buying spree, you know, not really thought out investments, buying like football clubs, some kind of hotels in Prague and so on. Suddenly it was found that you know, they had huge debt issues. in the end, the Chinese government had to step in, actually take over the CFC activities. The President Zeman's advisor actually disappeared in China. He's been in detention for a few years because of his involvement in corruption. And in the end, a vast majority of investments that were promised did not really materialize. So that's just a very quick overview, because I could go much deeper into that. But this is it's a very good case of how there were high expectations towards China, high level of political involvement, also with Chinese actors, whether private actors or Chinese Communist Party organizations. In the end, it didn't really lead to much benefit for the Czech Republic, but you could say also for China, because as a result of this, the ties have really worsened in the past few years. It's also a map of countries in Central Eastern Europe I mentioned that have joined the US on the issue of 5G. And excluding Huawei from their 5G networks. The opinion polls on China, I probably the upper graph is, I guess there's not the title about the overall perception. It doesn't show CEE countries as such, but you see, especially like in Czech Republic, how the views have worsened. But for example, Latvia is quite actually interesting, but we could maybe get into that later. So what has really happened? You could say that also the whole narrative of Central Eastern Europe has changed in the past few years. So basically becoming dragon fighters instead of panda huggers they were seen to be before. A big issue or big reason why, for example, Lithuania or Czech Republic can be quite assertive on China ties, or it was seen as the case, was that there's little direct exposure to China's economy. Something I said, the economic results of the corporation were quite limited. So even if there's, like, for example, a lot of imports from China, the actual imports of these countries to China have not really seen a lot of growth, or if they have seen growth, it was not as expected. Chinese investments quite limited. So all these issues really led to these countries being able to change their policy on China quite rapidly without really considering the implications, as for example, Germany has had to do, because it has much bigger direct exposure to China. But so we had in the past year really Lithuania being at the forefront, leaving 17+1, as I said, letting Taiwan open a representative office in Vilnius under the name Taiwanese, which was a huge issue with China. And but this Lithuania's behavior has really changed the understanding of how China can respond to this, because it's mostly been about direct exposure. How can, for example, China cut Lithuanian experts to China? Nobody's really worried about that much, because it's quite marginal. What China started to do is to use basically misuse global supply chains to put pressure on German companies, for example, and refuse to continue trading with them if they're going to source their components from Lithuania, which of course is a much bigger issue for Lithuania if you're trying to limit also the trade with the other EU countries. And this was not really expected by most people. And now we have expectations whether, for example, Slovenia, Czech Republic will follow the example of Lithuania and also be more assertive on China policy. And we have seen from Slovenia that there's been some statements from the prime minister that they're also going to develop close relations with Taiwan, for example, and so on. But I would say that it's going to change the calculus, and these countries that will probably make more confident moves on China will reconsider in light of Lithuania's experience. So we see it's basically the case of Czech Republic and its relationship with Taiwan in the past few years. From the economic and basically an unmet economic expectations, seeing Taiwan as some kind of potential new partner. Of course, the issue of values, as in Lithuania, is a big thing. So Taiwan presented as a democratic alternative to China, which can anyway bring a lot of economic opportunities in semiconductors and so on. And basically, this cartoon, you could say it's kind of outdated, because the belief that China doesn't really have that much leverage against CEE countries, including Lithuania, and like the threats are always perhaps bigger than they are, but China than they are in the end. But China decided to really move with its countermeasures this time. So just getting to the very end, which is just correcting that, the future scenarios for 16+1 and what can happen with the format. So these are not mutually exclusive. It can be the future can bring some kind of amalgam between these different scenarios, but anyway. So the first one is disintegration. So after Lithuania exited the platform last year, there was a talk that many other countries could follow. I think Estonia. There was some there were some statements from some officials that they could follow. In Czech Republic, for example, the new government, before they assumed the office, they were quite critical. The current foreign minister said, Czech Republic should definitely leave the format and should coordinate actually the move with other countries in the EU. So that's one kind of scenario that there's a coordinated exit of many countries and the whole format kind of disintegrates. Another is actually enlargement, and as I said, it's not mutually exclusive. Some countries can leave, some countries can join. We had this already happen with Greece in 2019. China trying to give the format new breath, new incentive for development. The issue is there's not much room for that anymore. So you have Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to join 16+1, of course. And the current situation, although I think wanted to in the past, but because of relationship with Russia, that's just not what China is going to do. Belarus, even though Belarus was observing at the format, there's no way that the countries in the format are going to agree with Belarus joining the format. Perhaps another option is Moldova, but China from the very beginning was hesitant to include countries that it sees as being in the Russian sphere of influence. So it's probably not likely. Interesting option would be Malta, actually, which is not in Central and Eastern Europe at all, but this was something that's discussed. The gradual weakening of the format is something I think is quite likely. So, China is not going to just say it's disbanding the format because it's a huge force of face, but, for example, making the summits not annual, but biannual, basically taking them down to the level of, for example, foreign ministers and not heads of state, would be something that China could do and kind of lose face and limit the, negative press. Second breath, this is something that could also happen. So although we're seeing a trend where many countries are turning away from China, but for example, Poland, if you look at Poland and what has been happening in the past year or so, I know a lot of intensive diplomatic contact between the two countries. President Duda visited the Olympics as one of the 2 EU leaders in Beijing this month. So still a lot of hope in Poland that it can somehow build a good relationship with China, even sometimes use it against Russia, which I think is a huge folly, but anyway. So, and China is also using Poland as, the biggest country in the format to also anti-incite other countries to stay. If Poland is staying, well, why should we be leaving? Some countries may say. So let's see how that will work out. And I'm also not excluding the possibility that other countries will also reconsider their China policy. So it's not set in stone. So these changes can happen. And perhaps not